This session is exciting for me. It's a passion of mine. And I think one of the challenges of what we've been through over the last 2 years is an inability to network and meet some people outside of our usual spheres. And so it was a fun opportunity to pull together three experts with disparate approaches and disparate backgrounds to talk about climate and housing markets. And Adam McKay, the filmmaker, has a new movie coming out around the holidays. That's an allegory for climate change about an asteroid that's going to hit Earth. And in an interview recently, he called climate change the biggest story in the history of upright apes. And I thought that was a good place to start when we're thinking about what a big deal this topic is. And really, housing and mortgage markets are where households are going to see the first serious impacts of climate change. And we think of a house as a durable asset that's going to reflect long-term risk and should really reflect that risk immediately. It should be incorporated into prices right away. And exactly how this information and how markets adjust and percolate through markets is really an open question. And it's been shaped by the three panelists today who are thinking about this topic. So I'm really excited to just first introduce our panel and then jump into the conversation. So I'll just do brief introductions alphabetically. So David Burt is founder and CEO of Delta Terra Capital. Before founding Delta Terra, David was a partner and portfolio manager at Wellington Management Company. Before that, he built investment processes at Blue Mountain Capital, Alder Tree Capital, which is a startup he founded to bet against the mortgage credit bubble, BlackRock Financial, and State Street Research. And he's an MIT alum. Daryl Fairweather is another MIT alum and is Redfin's chief economist. Before joining Redfin, she was a senior economist at Amazon, working on problems related to employee engagement and managing a team of analysts. During the housing crisis, Daryl worked as a researcher at the Boston Fed, studying why homeowners enter foreclosure. And in addition to her undergrad at MIT, she has a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. And then Miyuki Hino is an assistant professor of city and regional planning at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's an environmental social scientist working on measuring and managing impacts of climate change. Her work covers linkages between natural hazards, governance, public policy, how to drive effective and equitable adaptation to climate change. She has her PhD from Stanford's interdisciplinary program in environment and resources and a BS from Yale. So we have a very illustrative panel to talk today. And I think, Daryl, let's start with you. So first, you had some really fascinating testimony in October that was titled "Climate Change Will Exacerbate the U.S. Housing Shortage." And I'm curious, from your position at Redfin, to what extent do you think housing markets are already incorporating information about climate risks?
Yes, so I first started getting interested in climate change when I was trying to think through what are the biggest risks to the housing market. All the time people are telling me that the housing market is in a bubble, similar to what happened in 2006, but I really don't think that's the case. I think that housing is unaffordable for fundamental supply and demand reasons. And then climate change will make that worse. There are a couple ways that will happen. One is that some homes will literally be destroyed in natural disasters or become unlivable, like basement apartments flooding, for example. But also people will need to make investments in their homes to make them more resilient to adapt to climate change. Putting a metal roof on your home to make it more resilient to fire, elevating a home to make it more resilient to flooding, or even just putting in air conditioning. All these kinds of adaptations cost money and are going to drive up the costs of housing. One thing, we've done some surveys on Redfin on home buyers and home sellers, and we found that half of people who plan to move in the next year are considering climate risks when deciding where to move to. So it's definitely something people are thinking about. Then we looked at where people are actually moving, or they've been moving in the last 5 years. The Sun Belt is extremely popular. So Florida, Texas, Phoenix, Las Vegas, but they all have climate risk. If you look at it on whole, we looked at using data from Climate Check, more people are moving into areas with high risk than moving into areas with low risk. People are actually leaving some of the most resilient, naturally resilient areas like the upper Midwest for places in the Sun Belt. So it doesn't seem like this problem is naturally going to solve itself. So yeah, I just like to raise a little bit of an alarm for everybody out there. That's something we should be thinking about, especially given the already existing shortage of over 3.8 million homes we have in the country.
Yeah, that's a great place to start, I think, in thinking about, we have an initial shortage to begin with, and then thinking about the ways in which things are only getting worse based on migration patterns and otherwise. David, let's turn to you. Can you tell us a little bit about the work that Delta Terra is doing, and how are you seeing investors in real estate and financial markets thinking about and trying to influence the path of adaptation and sort of incorporating some of this new information about risk?
Sure. Well, first off, Ben, thanks for having me and for the warm introduction. I've been obsessing over these topics as well for the last several years as an institutional investor. And my education over that time a lot of it has come from the great work of Dr. Kuski and yourself, and a lot of the other collaborations that you all have done. So that makes me both very grateful for your work and also very humbled to be amongst all these great, inspiring climate warriors today. So to answer your question about how institutional investors, and this will lead into your question about Delta Terra, will influence the path of adaptation and changing risk perceptions. I think the primary channel, at least in the single family markets, and I'm going to narrowly keep it focused on that today, just because things get pretty complex when you move into the commercial space, is through the mortgage markets. So there's nearly $4 trillion in non-government mortgages out there that are mostly financed by institutional investors through their equity and debt investments in banks, non-financial mortgage company or non-bank financials, and even private label mortgage issuance, which is a shadow of what it used to be, but still out there. Additionally, a meaningful portion of the default risk on the nearly $6 trillion in loans guaranteed by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac get transferred back to these institutional investors through the issuance of various forms of credit risk transfer bonds, or CRT. So when an investor buys a bond that is exposed to mortgages backed by at-risk properties, that sends a really strong signal to lenders that it's okay to keep making similar loans. And that's really just how the markets work. Additionally, most homeowners rely heavily on the lender assessments of these risks to form their own assessment. So essentially believing that if the bank is willing to take the risk, then why should they be concerned? So, I personally believe that institutional investors will have a meaningful impact on the path forward based on the demands they make on lenders, really usually given their fiduciary responsibilities to do such. And that includes federally backed lenders, and the demands would be to take climate risk into account when they underwrite and price loans. So this is clearly starting to make its way into investor thinking now. We're working with a number of institutions to help measure the risks and start incorporating them in their day-to-day risk-taking activities. So based on our own extensive experience as investors, we found that it's very difficult to manage a risk that can't be measured. So towards that end, Delta Terra, which is an investment research company that I founded in 2019, is providing investors with the tools and impact assessments that they need to start leaning in. Also working with policymakers that can help minimize the damage done to homeowners, and particularly the most vulnerable homeowners, as the inevitable asset value adjustments come about when these expectations do rationalize.
That's great. Thanks so much, David. And I think that transitions really well to Miyuki and some of her work and sort of helping some of the most vulnerable communities. So Miyuki, I was trying to think of the right metaphor for this. I think it's sort of like, when you hear a song on Spotify or something like that, and you're so impressed by it, you go back and you listen to all of that band's albums. I felt like that with your paper with Marshall Burke. when I saw that paper come across Twitter or wherever I first saw it on how overvalued properties are, I said I have to go back and read everything. So super exciting work, but also work on some of them. I think that the sort of distributional impacts are really crucial, right? So it's one thing to kind of offer like the big headline numbers, and it's easy in the housing market to talk about trillions. And so it sounds like it's a big deal, and it is, but how are you thinking about the tools that policymakers have in place to help some of those most vulnerable communities and the most vulnerable households?
Well, thanks, Ben. Thanks for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here and looking forward to learning a lot from the panelists here. Yeah, I think it's been certainly in the last couple of years, we've seen a lot more momentum from policymakers and from regulators interested in this issue, seeing kind of the train coming down the tracks type of thing. I want to pick up on two things that have actually already been mentioned by the other panelists. One is the idea that half of these potential movers are expressing concern about climate risk, yet moving into places that are really hazardous. And one of the things we found in our research is that there does seem very much to be a lack of access to information at the time that buyers need it when they're making a choice about where to live. So you have lots of buyers who are finding out that they live in a place that's flood prone or fire prone well after they've made an offer, right? Sometimes, very often it's from the lender, right? As David said, sometimes it's after they've flooded, right? That someone comes up and tells them that they live in a floodplain. And so one role here, I think we can all agree that when people are making a decision about where to invest their money, they should have good access to information to make that choice. And so one role here, I think a clear one for policymakers is to make that information available, making information easy to access about what has flooded before, what has been affected by fire before, how are those risks potentially going to change in the future. When it comes to, I think, the most marginalized communities, often I think there's a separate issue, which is the availability of safe and affordable housing. A lot of the marginalized communities that live in really hazardous places, they're not there by choice, right? They're there because decades ago, that was the only land that they had access to. And in some cases, that land has become even more hazardous over time because of a lack of investment, right? And neglect and disinvestment over time. And so in those situations, awareness is not so much the issue, right? It's lack of alternatives. And so if collectively we don't invest in protecting the affordable housing that exists now and actually working to increase the provision of safe and affordable housing, that's what makes that information actionable, right? That's what makes that awareness actionable. And I think we do think a lot about the supply that exists and how that might be changing in value over time. But if we don't address this really pressing constraint of the lack of safe, affordable housing, then it's going to be very, very difficult to protect the communities that are most at risk right now.
It's a really great point. And I want to just follow up on the information angle with you, Daryl. So for those of you out there who don't follow Daryl on Twitter, you should go and rectify that immediately because she always is posting thoughtful and deep insights into the housing market. I think, that sort of clarity of thought and thinking about the role of information in this space, right? So you're a great communicator. Your firm and you in particular are communicating a lot about these risks sort of writ large. And then specifically, one of the interesting changes I've seen with Redfin is that there's now information about flood risk directly on the property page. So I checked my flood factor score on Redfin earlier today. We can talk more about the accuracy of that maybe later offline, but what's Redfin's role in sort of spreading information more widely and sort of the issues around both efforts on the public side and the private side to get this information into people's hands at the time when they're actually making decisions?
Yes, so on the Redfin website and on the app, we have lots of information about homes, whether it's the actual details of the home, like how many stories it is, or the neighborhood. We recently this year added in data from flood factor from First Street Foundation. So every single home, you can look up and see what its flood factor is on a scale of 1 to 10. And there's even a cool infographic that shows you how flood risk increases over time. We got this data from First Street Foundation. So if you have questions about the modeling, you would have to ask them. But that is, I think, another issue that we're going to have to grapple with, is that there will be different models that give different answers. And that's something that Redfin has been thinking a lot about recently, like how do we know which score to go with? We have other data from Climate Check. Right now it's on the neighborhood pages, but it will be moving to the listing pages. So you can look it up for an individual home as opposed to a neighborhood. And that has scores for storm, drought, heat, and I'm missing one. Heat. Fire risk. So that is already on the site, but it's a little bit hidden. It will be in a more prominent position by early next year. But even for Climate Check and for flood factor, Climate Check does have flood risk, but we decided to go with flood factor because their data seemed more engaging just because it had more detail to it. But as an economist, I don't really have a way to evaluate like which score is better. And I don't know if anyone has that ability because every model is always going to be slightly different. But taking a step back from the consumer view, we believe that it's really important that home buyers and home sellers have this information. A home buyer can choose a different home or a different location based on climate risk. A home seller can try to invest in ways to make their home more climate resilient if they are in an area that has risk. And hopefully this will nudge people to just make more informed decisions. But as Miyuki pointed out, people are constrained. They have set budgets. They need to be close to their jobs or close to their family. So I think it's something to be seen whether this actually does influence people to choose different homes or different locations and how much that will change over time as climate change becomes more salient to people.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the introduction of this on the page can represent a form of a natural experiment, right? I mean, there's not really a good control group necessarily. There's kind of a one-time treatment. And we did get a question in the chat asking when Redfin exactly began posting that flood factor. I don't know if you know the exact date, but you know, curious, I think, there and thinking about whether you've already seen effects on people, you know, dwelling on that or clicking through to that at this point.
Yeah, I'll preview some research we're already doing. So I've been working with Professors Matt Kahn and Robert Metcalf and an intern who's actually a PhD student at MIT's Urban Planning School to evaluate the flood factor data we put on the site. We did an A/B test this time last year that lasted 3 months. I believe it was from October to December, where half of Redfin users saw the flood score and half didn't. And we did notice a statistically significant change in the kinds of homes that they viewed. They did start viewing homes with lower flood risk. I mean, it was a small change, but it is there, and it's there in almost every major metro that we launched in. And we also noticed that people started to expand their geographic search. It doesn't seem, I mean, this is preliminary, but it doesn't seem like people changed their budgets or changed the number of bedrooms or any other home features. The one thing that changed is they started to look in more areas than they did before.
Oh, that's super interesting. I really look forward to seeing that. You know, I'm not surprised that Matt Kahn is working on these kinds of things. This is definitely in his wheelhouse, and excited that he's partnering with you to not only have the data, but also to have a setting where you can really have that kind of A/B test, right? You can have a true control group that might not see the information. So David, I want to turn back to you and thinking about these trade-offs and thinking about, on the one hand, we have information, right? So just the provision of information and how households respond. But on the other hand, we have things that actually hit their pocketbooks. And risk rating 2.0 is the thing that's now kind of hitting households' pocketbooks very directly. And you wrote a great research note for November that kind of did a deep dive into the earliest results I've seen about the consequences of risk rating 2.0's rollout, both in terms of the number of policies that are being issued in the areas that are affected, but then also what's happening in these housing markets. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what you found?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll just take it right to the numbers that we've been seeing. You know, we've been looking forward to this because the way that risk rating 2.0 rolled out was a bit confusing. So there was a national analysis presented by FEMA that suggested incrementally kind of small changes in rates for folks. But that really only applied to people who already had existing policies. And their rate increases are capped at 18% a year based on law. So that's what the analysis spoke to, is all these people having 18% increases in their rates. What we expected, and this appears to be the case, is that the actual end rates that are being calculated through FEMA's new risk rating process are going to be much higher than they used to be. And we are seeing anecdotal evidence suggesting, 2 to 3x being the average, but frequently 10x. And ultimately, what this is leading to in the data, and we've been obsessing over just whatever high frequency data we can get our hands on. Actually, one of the sources of data that we've been looking at is sales activity from Redfin. So thank you, Daryl. And that weekly basis does suggest a very significant year-over-year slowdown in the most exposed communities to these risk rating 2.0 resets. And we make that assessment based on a combination of take-up rate and pricing in the community, which are both very important factors given the way that this was structured with that 18% cap nuance. So ultimately, if a community has very low take-up rate, then none of the potential borrowers in that community will get the benefit of the 18% statutory cap on increases, and will generally be facing a much bigger cost in flood insurance as a community. So that's the other thing we see bearing out in the data based on released NFIP policy data from FEMA. And they've been having some bugs with their most recent release, but it looks like we've got a good chunk of October in and a bit of November. And what we've seen is that you can calculate, and they publish individual policy records, and you can calculate whether a policy with a given effective date is a new policy, because they also publish the first date that that policyholder had a policy with NFIP. So you just subtract those two, and if it's 0, it's a new policy. And so what you've seen is October and November, usually new policies represent about 10% of a creation cohort for NFIP. Say in any given month, 10% of the policies that get created will be new policies. In October and November, it's like less than 0.5%. And what that says to us is new policy applicants are seeing the risk rating 2.0 rates and are turning them down. And so this is when this actually starts to become a real problem in these communities. So we can talk all about how mispriced these insurance premiums and these insurance markets are. But ultimately, if they remain completely mispriced forever and ever, what's going to change? And so this is a big focus of our investigation, is what are the catalysts? And it does seem like in this instance, there's about 30,000 NFIP policies that will not be being created a month because the new rates are too high. Now, we are desperately, we're looking forward to risk rating 2.0. And it's probably the most important thing from our perspective in shaping the future of mitigation, just because there's all this false signaling to homeowners, and that actually affects the policies they vote for. And so ultimately, we thought that this was one of the most important rollouts that we could have for the path of mitigation. And this makes it really difficult to support, because unfortunately, those low take-up communities that are probably the ones who are now unable to enter the program because they're applying for new policies, those tend to be more marginalized communities. And there's been plenty of research suggesting that compliance is much higher in more affluent communities with, for instance, the mandatory purchase requirement for flood insurance. So even though FEMA has billed risk rating 2.0 as equity in action, and there are some equity influencing aspects to the rating methodology, we feel that the impact is likely going to be really troubling for communities that were already struggling with affordability and therefore had fallen out of compliance. So that's the big takeaway, is there's basically nobody taking the new rates, whether those are folks applying for refinances in SFHAs, where flood insurance is mandatory, and then not being able to refi their mortgage. That's possibly what's happening to those folks. Or it could be new buyers coming in and walking away from a deal. So those are both troubling implications in real life going on right now, as these expectations start to change with the actual changes to the structure supporting them.
Thanks so much, David. And it's just a fascinating topic. And I think, you mentioned kind of in thinking about the set of catalysts, sort of the things that are going to really shape housing markets going forward. I mean, one is disasters, right? So the actual disaster events, and then the other are these substantial policy changes that are going to critically change how costly it is for building and for living in these areas. And Miyuki, I'm curious in how you sort of think about some of these trade-offs with affordability concerns and the sort of possible paths. I mean, so we have the catalysts on one side, and then we have sort of the transition paths on the other, right? So communities can make themselves more resilient, and they can sort of adapt in different ways. Or we can also think about, what's politically a more, disputed or contentious approach, which is to think about retreat or repositioning. And you have a really interesting piece on managed retreat. So I wanted to kind of ask you, how do different communities think about this, and how do different policymakers think about the choices and the trade-offs?
Yeah, well, David, that was really, really fascinating insight into risk rating 2.0. And I think it brings up this broader question about how we manage climate risk and the extent to which this is a social endeavor, right? An endeavor to protect the most vulnerable communities, even when that runs counter to sort of absolute measures of risk reduction, versus, right, this approach where we're changing the insurance prices because they should reflect risk. And those are going to have different impacts on different communities. And, that's that. And I think there's a lot of the debate around the NFIP and the direction it goes ultimately comes back to that question, which is, what is the goal of the program? What are we really trying to achieve with it overall? I think this question of ultimately, are there places that are too hazardous to inhabit? Like, are there places that ultimately we're better off not putting people in? Is really tied to this conversation around housing and insurance. Communities, local governments in particular, are very worried about removing any housing stock that exists, right? Which makes a lot of sense given the constraints that we have in producing new housing. And they're also very motivated to protect their tax base, right? So they're also interested in maintaining as much property as possible, even when it's in really hazardous places. And then individuals, I think, maybe, for instance, interested in engaging with a government program that will buy out their house and restore that land to permanent open space if they think that their house might become unsellable on the private market. And so these insurance changes can really affect both the way that individuals are thinking about their house as an investment and their ability to sell it and move on to somewhere else. And also to some extent, I think how local governments are thinking about ultimately where are the places where we think are the best for development in the space that we have available. And so the nuance here between, I think, policies that already exist and potential new policies, right, that might influence where construction is more likely to occur and not occur, which again is very closely related to this question about ultimately where are the places that we think are safe and long-term sustainable investable places. I think when it comes to retreat, the conversation is always very difficult. It doesn't matter what community, what household, what neighborhood we're talking about. I think it gets even harder when we're talking about communities that have had multi-generational, deep connections to place and have endured many, many challenges over time to remain in place. But I do think that there are situations where moving and ultimately finding a fresh start on safer ground is better. It's either preferable or it creates new access to educational and economic opportunity that wasn't possible in the place where they were before. And so is it the right option everywhere? No, but I think it's an important option to have on the table for people where it's the right fit.
That's such a great way to think about it. I think the other thing you mentioned was this long-term aspect, right? That we can't just make decisions about today or tomorrow because houses are long-lived, durable assets, and the infrastructure that we need to support houses in a neighborhood when we're thinking about roads and electricity and water, those are extremely durable choices. When we make those choices and we put down a blueprint for a planned community or something like that, that's going to persist for 50 years, 100 years, or much, much more. And so, one of the things that's interesting to me about Risk Rating 2.0 is that it's sort of the first dynamic information that's come to the marketplace. So rather than just getting a static update like, hey, your insurance has gone up by $25 this year, it's like, no, here's the path. Here's where your insurance is headed over the next however many years at 18% growth per year until it actually gets to something that's in the right actuarial ballpark. And in a setting where risk is growing over time, which is the other compounding feature of this challenge, right? It's not a static risk either. So you have these long-lived assets and this dynamically growing risk. So important to be thinking about making these choices that aren't just great for today, but are great for the next 50 years or 100 years. I could ask you guys questions all day, but I want to open things up to the Q&A, and we have some questions that have already been rolling in. I want to encourage those of you joining us out there to jump into the Q&A box and add to the list here. So Daryl, a question came in, which is interesting. And I might ask David this question to you as well. In thinking about the different data products that are out there, right? So you have a huge number of data providers that are providing risk metrics at some level of geography across all these different climate risks. What responsibility do you think that the real estate market, the financial market, or a firm like Redfin has in sort of validating the data products? I mean, it's difficult from an outsider's perspective to assess which model is better. But what's your thought process in evaluating climate data analytics that's coming across your desk?
Yeah, I honestly don't think Redfin has the right people to make those evaluations. We can evaluate a product based on its user experience, whether it's engaging, whether people on Redfin click on it, but the actual score, we pretty much have to defer to the climate experts. I would hope that down the road, there is some kind of third-party, nonprofit government agency that does start to rank these risks and maybe put some scores on, or maybe there's some feedback on which scores are better than others, but it's pretty much untestable in the short term to know which of these risks is accurate. And there are so many factors that you wouldn't even be able to test it, like what infrastructure is invested in places that have high climate risk, or not just physical infrastructure, social infrastructure as well. If one area has the same climate risk as another area, let's say, but in place A, everybody abandons it because they believe that they don't have the ability to mitigate against those risks, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. That place will become unlivable as more people leave and the homes will become devalued, and you'll just have, or you'll have decay in that area. But if place B, they get together and they decide they are going to do something about it, and people stay and they make the investments in their homes and in their communities, that it will be successful. So it's really hard to model that aspect of it. And some climate models try to take those things into account, but it's just a really, really hard problem. So I don't have a good answer for you on that just yet.
Yeah, no, I think part of that is also that we have this challenge with the sort of politically drawn flood map boundaries, right? And so we have those boundaries which have historically been very political, and part of what's changing is not just the risk rating, but also the remapping efforts. And I had a very personal experience with this in Philadelphia a couple months ago, where my neighborhood near the Schuylkill River was flooded, and my house is in the flood zone. I mean, I have flood insurance, but we don't have a basement because it was built, after the flood zone was already in place. Whereas my neighbors have older houses, which were all built prior to the creation of the flood zone, and all their basements flooded. And if you go to where the flooding happened and you sort of overlay the latest Philadelphia flood maps, it lines up perfectly, like almost to the house of, where did the water get to? So you do have these opportunities to validate the data with tail risks, but those are infrequent, and hopefully very infrequent in, at least in my personal experience. So David, when you're thinking about this, like you're advising investors to incorporate climate risk information into their decision making, right? So how do you think about the quality of that information, and how do you vet the different sources of information?
Wow, how much time do we have? I'll do it in like 3 minutes. No, I mean, absolutely. I mean, this is absolutely core to the entire Delta Terra thesis, which is the big part of the problem is exactly what you're focused on, Ben. Is there's a difference between what people currently expect to pay for protection versus what they should expect to pay for protection. Obviously, to even begin that work, and this is all the work that we want to do, so we've spent a ton of time on this, you need some ability to pinpoint that what they should expect to pay. And regardless of what you feel about how insurance markets work and how the government redistribution systems might work, ultimately not a bad assessment of that would be an expectation of actual physical acute damage probabilities. And so it's a key hunt for us. Historically, insurers and other hazard risk takers have always relied on these actuarial techniques that implicitly assume risk is kind of static over time. Now we know risk to be trending with temperature. So there's this whole new effort to get a hold of, well, what's this gap, A, and how do we project the trend in this risk into the future? And that it really hasn't been addressed by the traditional hazard modeling experts who are bound to their actuarial principles just by the nature of the industry they serve. So this is changing. But honestly, the nascency of what many refer to now as a climate conditioned hazard models is currently a pretty large hurdle, and hopefully will alleviate over time, given so many great efforts out there at the big traditional hazard modeling firms like RMS and AIR Worldwide and Cat Risk, but also this whole new slew of experts across both nonprofit and for-profit. Daryl mentioned a couple, First Street Foundation, I speak with a lot, and I look at their data. I work with a firm called RISQ, that does the estimates specifically at like a community resolution that's helpful for mortgage analysis. But there's a whole other slew of them out there: Jupiter Intelligence, Servest, 427, Grow, One Concern, the list goes on and on, Climate Project. So anyways, a lot of people are trying to come up with these things. Unfortunately, many of the models, they offer very varied perspectives on risk, and sometimes actually produce nonsensical results. And most of these models have been rigorously peer-reviewed in academia, and the science has been scrutinized to no end, but very few of them have actually undergone the actuarial rigor that anyone would insist upon to actually rely on a hazard risk projection. So we think that'll improve over time. I mean, honestly, in the short term, we've calibrated climate condition models to historic evidence using our own statistical methods. And over time, the condition parametric modeling inputs will improve. But yeah, it is a really big challenge right now. One way to really just frame it in terms of dollars is we look at each of these views across the whole single family residential market. So across the 88 million homes in the continental US, our model, what we call the CLIMA model, takes these inputs, calibrates them, and comes up with roughly an expectation of 25 billion a year annually from flooding to just to single family properties. A historic insurance agency hazard modeling firm might come up with something like 18, because they haven't actually adjusted for the trend in resulting from increasing temperature. Mm-hmm. A typical climate condition hazard modeling from one of these third-party consultants will come up with like 60. And you just know it's wrong. And the way we've calibrated this is to create these estimated realized damages from sparse evidence in history. So there's this just shortfall, right? You have to do a lot of filling in the blanks because of the nature, the uninsured nature of flood risk for the last 50 years. I mean, it's a lot of like intense statistical extrapolation. Eventually everyone will land on something, just as we've kind of standardized IPCC scenarios for the science input. And then there's also been a lot of standardization around a process known as downscaling to make location estimates more precise. I think similarly, we'll end up with some standardized techniques for calibrating climate condition hazard estimates to historic evidence.
It's super useful to hear the context and the approach that you're taking. And I think there's some optimism there that we're going to converge rather than that we're going to end up in different camps with different fights over which model is the most reliable or most accurate. So we'll see. Hopefully we can head in that direction. But Miyuki, do you want to add to that? Or I was going to ask you a little bit more generally about that as well. So go right ahead.
I just wanted to emphasize one thing that Daryl said, and especially as we're talking about long-term projections. Obviously, modeling current hazard is challenging in itself, and there's inherent uncertainties in that. But it's not only the climate-related uncertainty; it's the human-related uncertainty that Daryl was talking about. And one of the concerns that that comes back to me really often is projections of sea level rise don't necessarily relate to differences in risk, because we do things to interfere with the hazard, right? And we build seawalls and we elevate houses. And ultimately, the risk is not just a function of how much the sea level rises. And the reason that brings me so much concern is because people will ask me, for example, about a small community in the Chesapeake Bay. And they'll say, well, how could we possibly keep them safe if they stay there, right? Like, what would happen to them if they don't move? But nobody ever asked me that about Miami. And so I think there's this real like self-fulfilling prophecy risk where the sea level rise projections are taken to be fate for certain communities and not others. And so we just allow it. We assume that the risk is going to get worse in certain places, but our beliefs are such that even though sea levels are going to rise in all these other places too, that's not actually going to translate to risk. And therefore our asset pricing models and so forth don't actually need to adjust for that, because we're going to intervene in other ways to make it happen. So I just worry about sort of, to some extent, the misuse or accidental weaponization of this type of information when we're talking about a long-term future that ultimately is dictated by human and societal choices, in addition to climate scenarios.
Yeah, and it's sort of interesting, right, that coming back to Daryl's earlier point about that it seems like people, if anything, are migrating towards the riskier areas at the moment, right? And so what you're going to need is actually like an even bigger reaction in the long run to some of these risks. I mean, it seems like, Daryl, on this point, the your work that you showed on wildfire risk in that slide deck was really interesting, and I hadn't realized just how exposed the residents of Utah are to wildfire risk. I mean, that really jumped off the page. But do you have a sense that people are still migrating into harm's way in those locations, or do you think those are so I guess my question is, your surveys showed that in general, people are thinking about these risks, and that there are specific locations that are especially risky, but are the people who are going to those locations the most naive, or do they have some awareness about what they're getting into? Like, do they have their heads in the sand when it comes to the realities of rising temperatures and greater risks for wildfires, or do you think that they're sort of coming in with clear eyes about this?
Both. I think that people understand that climate change is going to get worse, and that if they're moving to an area that already has wildfire risk, will likely increase in the future. But when it comes down to it, that's a very abstract risk that's in the future, whereas how much their monthly mortgage payment is going to be, or whether they can commute to work or take care of their elderly parents, those are much more tangible costs right now. So I think in the end, it makes sense that the things that they can measure and that that they know are going to impact them end up outweighing the climate risk, which is very abstract and far in the future.
Yeah, and I think to sort of tie that into costs and pricing, right? We then overlay on top of that states like California, which has basically required insurance companies to provide wildfire risk in some form, even if it's not profitable for them to do so, right? And so then there's a question about how long will that persist, and whether properties will become uninsurable, and whether that's going to be lead to more people bearing those risks themselves, and there's sort of differences in risk perception, or whether that will sufficiently steer them away. And this sort of points to the mortgage market as being able to play a potential role here. So David, one of the questions that we got from Michael in the audience is, how can the institutional investor community recognize and reward climate resilience within the mortgage market? For instance, properties or communities that have mitigated a natural hazard risk. And are you seeing any actions like that with the $4 trillion you mentioned, I think, of institutional investor-backed mortgages?
Yeah, no, not yet. I mean, if anything, ultimately, if anything's likely to come about, it's the transmission is either through the community credits through the NFIP. So that's one way that people can reduce pocketbook costs in a community, is to get a higher NFIP score. Obviously doesn't do anything for wildfire. I mean, one of the things that you said, Ben, was that California has stopped insurers for leaving. Those moratoriums are each good for 1 year. Mm-hmm. Right. So you've got to imagine right now, most of those moratoriums are expiring right now. Right. So all those folks who, based on Daryl's research, just moved into these places may be looking at much, much higher insurance premiums through the FAIR program starting now, or at their first renewal. So, I mean, that's one thing to take into account. Now, ultimately, how can this does happen a little bit in the commercial space. So for instance, there are lenders who will offer a discounted coupon on a loan for a LEED certified building. So that I haven't seen anything like that. And as I mentioned, the commercial place is a lot more complex and honestly a little more forward thinking because it's so heterogeneous and there's a lot more private capital involved in setting these rates. So like when you think about it, I mean, 8 trillion of the 12 trillion in mortgage credit risk in the United States is government backed, right? So that's what's got to move. Now, you know, are you going to end up giving a Fannie loan to somebody at a lower rate because they've engaged in mitigation? I think it's much more likely that they'll get a standard rate, and if they haven't engaged in mitigation, that they get charged an additional what's called an LLPA, or a loan level pricing adjustment, that actually puts them into a more expensive loan. So I haven't seen anything yet for that. Again, some really nascent moves in lending channels on the in the commercial space. I mean, one of the big problems out there is that mortgage investors aren't thinking a lot about this risk because there's just a lot of confusion about who kind of owns the risk or who bears it. And, you know, historically, after every major disaster, what mortgage investors have seen is a big spike in delinquencies. And then 18 months later, all of those delinquencies have cured, and the borrowers have essentially been bailed out through a combination of insurance, you know, government aid, and most importantly, speculative interest from home flippers in a community who go out and bail out these distressed borrowers. Now, the only reason that bid is there is because they know they can still get a cheap NFIP policy, and they know they can still get a cheap Freddie or Fannie loan. And so nothing has actually changed about the structural costs within that market. So of course prices don't go down. Now, you know, if mortgage originators who were actually taking credit risk, right, a lot of the credit risk, again, it does get pushed to the agencies. And that's a complicated dynamic that would take too long to go through. But it results in these CRT bonds that have the same sort of exposure. And ultimately, you know, when people begin to understand that this is actually a matter of home price depreciation risk, then they'll start to care and they'll start to price it. You know, I really just think that that's just beginning to happen now because of these changes, the end of the wildfire moratoriums, risk rating 2.0, and probably most importantly is actually scrutiny around the mandatory purchase requirement by the GAO, by the Government Accountability Office. That's a really important one. No one's really been able to directly stare down the low compliance problem in the US. You know, and people have been looking at the mandatory purchase requirement. You guys have done a ton of work on this. Dr. Kuski has done a ton of work on this. And, you know, there's still 2 and 3 properties that is supposed to be subject to the MPR doesn't maintain flood insurance. So that's, you know, scrutiny as that changes, and as they expand the boundaries essentially, or the homes that are captured under the mandatory purchase requirement, that also creates a whole new needle to thread in terms of, okay, we need to better inform these communities that are outside the old stale maps, but we can't make it unaffordable for them to get into the program. And that's so far that challenge hasn't been addressed adequately. So I think that's something that we're trying to spend as much time with policymakers as we can to get across. But I think that's really one of the biggest challenges ahead, is how we deal in the mortgage markets with this confusion about mortgage investors thinking this is an insured problem, and it isn't.
Right.
So that's, yeah.
On this sort of issue with insurance take-up and insurance shortfalls, Miyuki, I'll direct this one to you. Question from Malik. So both climate risk and mortgages are long-term, long-term risks, long-term obligations. Should we be thinking about insurance market reforms that are sort of aligning incentives in a more long-term way? Should we encourage long-term insurance contracts that last for, say, the life of the mortgage or something along those lines, instead of requiring households to roll over policies year by year?
It is a really interesting idea. And I think it was actually in a conversation with Dr. Kuski that I was first introduced to this idea and thought it was so interesting, because I do think that being told this is your insurance for this year is very different than this is your insurance for this year, and over the next 30 years, it's going to go up by a factor of 10. And right now, I mean, in the new risk rating 2.0 policy documents, I think if you read it closely, you can see in some instances how your price may change over time, but I don't know that every homeowner is going to read their policy statement in such detail. And so I do think it conveys, certainly, I think, more valuable information about the direction and the potential magnitude of change. The worry I have, and this comes back to what I was saying earlier, is that it portrays that change in risk as something that's not changeable. And that's not true, right? So if you want to incentivize someone to put a better roof on their house that's more resistant, or to elevate their house, there should be a corresponding change in your premium for making that investment. And so saying, here's your insurance for the next 10 years, maybe you still have a provision to do that, but I think it really changes the way that the homeowner is thinking about risk and how they can, how they might invest in their property to change that insurance. And I think, we, for example, in the National Flood Insurance Program, if you're in a 100-year levee zone, right, if you're in a federally protected area, then you're considered safe. And that should be something that's changing over time, right? That should be something that we evaluate regularly, and that that standard of protection could drop below, and that would change your insurance costs and so forth. And so I think it's important to demonstrate to buyers that the risk is dynamic, but not in a way that's out of their control. And so it's a combination of empowering people to see how the risks might change through time, but also to see, these are my options and this is what I can do about changing that risk.
Yeah, that's such a useful way to think about it. And I think giving people the information, but also giving them the agency, right, to change that path and say, here are the things that you can do for your house, in terms of making your home more resilient. And then here are the things that your community can do, right? You can vote to improve the infrastructure in these specific ways, or build a seawall, or, so that's the kind of thing that can activate local support. And the politics of this are so challenging in terms of what local governments can accomplish versus what you need to rely on, the federal government or state governments to implement, especially in a setting where we're in one of these spirals, right? Where we already see a tax base eroding and we already see prices falling. If we're to that point, it's gonna be very difficult for a community to, increase the taxes and collect more funds to fund that infrastructure. So giving people that agency with those kinds of forward-looking policies, I think, is really promising. Daryl, I wanted to ask you about some of the work that Redfin did thinking about inequality and climate. And so really fascinating, work on, you have this map of Sacramento, which was just a case study, but I think is true in a lot of other cities, at sort of thinking about racial inequality and exposure to climate risks. I wondered if you could just tell us a bit about the work that you did there.
Yes, I believe Miyuki touched on this a little bit earlier about how historically groups of people, their only option was to live in areas that had high flood risk. With redlining, the areas that were redlined as high risk are still to this day have higher flood risk than the areas that were not redlined. That's just one way to proxy for whether community may be majority Black and maybe higher risk. But even if you look at it nationally, most areas like Chicago, Sacramento, the areas with more flood risk do tend to be lower income, have more minority residents. Florida is really interesting because the most highly sought after property is on the coast. Little Haiti, for example, in Miami is elevated and has lower flood risk than the rest of Miami. So there you have to worry about climate gentrification. And that's going to be a huge issue too, because a community might do all the right things and make all the right investments, but their most vulnerable citizens might get priced out, especially if they're renters. There's a bit of a debate about whether it's better to be a renter or a homeowner with climate change. And it really is about whether you're able to take on the risk or not. If you rent, you have the benefit of being able to pick up and move to a different area, but you could also be displaced through gentrification. If you own, you bear the risk of whether your area becomes more desirable or less desirable with climate change. But if it becomes less desirable, you're on the hook for that as well. And going back to like the point about insurance and the mortgage industry, that can kind of pervert incentives as well, because somebody might take on a whole lot of debt knowing that if things really get bad, they'll just abandon their home. So that's not going to be good for financial security or financial stability of the whole country if that happens in mass. But I guess going back to your original question about inequality, climate change will make the problems of inequality a lot worse, because most certainly the people who are most vulnerable aren't going to be able to adapt to climate change the way that somebody who is wealthy is able to. Whether you own your home or you rent, if you have the money, you can put in the investment or you can pick up and move. And if you don't have the money, you're going to be stuck where you are or forced out of where you are.
Yeah, we found the same thing in our research in Florida. And the highest poverty neighborhoods are the ones where sea level rise exposure seems to be having the biggest initial impact. And I think a lot of that is just that there's this lack of flexibility, right? So on the one hand, you might anticipate that we're a community that isn't going to have the resources necessarily to adapt in the ways that we would need to in order to stay to stay safe and protect ourselves. But on top of that, then you just don't have necessarily the liquidity to fund those kinds of adjustments, or to sort of be flexible in your timing of when you're selling the property as well, right? And so you're sort of forced, if there is a disaster that comes through, to David's point earlier, you're kind of like forced to sell in a fire sale, under fire sale conditions, to a home flipper or something like that, rather than being able to hang on and do some repairs and sell when the market, you can time the market a bit better as well. So I think to your other point, Florida is interesting in that I think it holds a really strong sort of vision in people's minds about what it means to live near the water. That it's desirable, right, to live near water in Florida, and beachfront view is what everyone's going for on the HGTV shows. But in reality, many cases living near water is extremely risky and harmful and dangerous. And in a lot of cities, the neighborhoods that are closest to the water have historically been those that were the least desirable neighborhoods, and were so because of their history of flooding. So it's really useful to have that perspective put out there to sort of push against this idea that being close to the water is an amenity, that there's no downside risks there. I wanted to ask, just sort of staying on this topic a bit, David, for your, in thinking about some of the policies that the GSEs have, we got a question from Carlos about the GSE's duty to serve requirements, right? So in terms of the neighborhoods in which they are required to lend in, how should we think about the tension between their requirement to lend in those communities and then the fact that they have heightened climate exposure?
Yeah, it's a dual mandate, certainly, because and through the FHFA, right, the agencies also have a duty to not to generate loans that then will create losses on the part of taxpayers. So to the extent that the agencies are in conservatorship, right, if one of these areas goes bad and there's a lot of defaults and mortgage losses, that gets just passed directly through to the taxpayer at this point. Other than potentially some CRT risk takers. So one thing to think about here is the agencies are mostly going to be focused on their duty to serve. And they are going to risk manage based on the mandates attributed or given to them by their regulator, the FHFA, which is highly focused on this right now. The third party risk takers within credit that fund their taking of all of this mortgage credit risk. So those would be CRT investors. So those are the two driving forces on the side of say increasing mortgage rates for areas that are particularly risky. And mainly though, they're focused on lending to anyone who has demonstrated that they can pay off a mortgage, right, to facilitate liquidity and housing opportunities for every U.S. citizen. So that's it is a very difficult tension. The one thing I would suggest is that they aren't always in conflict, because you're not doing someone a favor when you lend them money against an overvalued home. So if someone puts 20% down and then you lend them the other 80%, but that home was overvalued by 20% to begin with, right? That might not be taking on a huge risk on the part of the taxpayer, upsetting that side of the push and pull. But that could be extremely damaging to the person who borrowed the money. And like we said earlier, it's, this was, the subprime, the easy credit in 2006 and 2007, people made this argument. They're like, what a great thing. I mean, we're making credit available to all these folks who otherwise couldn't afford it. And ultimately, it was a terrible thing for those communities and for those borrowers. And, you have that in hindsight, but it's the same kind of thing. Like, you qualify someone now on a debt to income ratio that anticipates an NFIP premium of $500 a year. And then their NFIP premium goes to $5,000 a year. Right. All of a sudden, they can't afford that loan, and you shouldn't have made it to them. It's like qualifying someone on the teaser rate of 228. These are these famous loans in 2006 where you paid this really low rate for 2 years, and then your rate went up. And you would get qualified on your ability to pay the rate for the first 2 years. I mean, that made no sense. And we're doing the exact same thing right now with regard to insurance affordability. And that's problematic both for borrowers and taxpayers or the risk takers on the other side of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And interesting to think about the parallels, right, between the way in which the market was fueled in the 2000s and the way in which we could think about the market being fueled today, especially in the midst of some of these COVID motivated migration patterns that we're seeing. So Miyuki, I wanted to, we're sort of coming up to, our last few minutes. I wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit about this really interesting piece you had in Nature earlier this year about this challenge that so much of the research that we have thus far is really skewed towards the more resilient places and the more resilient people. I mean, I focus my research in the US and, certainly David and Daryl are both more US focused in their efforts, but I'm curious about your thoughts on the ways in which we might be able to improve some of the data and metrics going forward to make sure that we're reaching those most vulnerable populations.
Thanks, Ben. I think I am absolutely guilty of this as well, but we, as someone mentioned earlier on this panel, it's easy to talk in trillions of dollars. And these large headline dollar figures, they get attention, they get concern, they can motivate changes in policy and so forth. But that is really being driven by a tiny segment of the landscape and of the population, right? The holders of those assets. And so I think even looking more broadly at climate risk management, so many of our decisions are driven by costs and benefits and by dollar values, and being able to put a dollar value on avoided damages by building this levee or whatever it may be, And we can see now that that criteria and those choices systematically disadvantaged large groups of people consistently over time, and has led to outcomes that we really are unhappy with. And so I think, and as I said, I'm guilty of this as well, but trying to push more towards really focusing on the who and not just the dollar numbers, and focusing on the populations and the types of populations that are at risk, that are exposed, that are experiencing the impacts, and recognizing that, you know, that that change in asset value of $20,000, or that increase in insurance prices from $500 to $5,000, that might be, for some people, that might be a rounding error, right, on the way that they're thinking about their budgets and their assets. And for others, that's the difference between being able to stay in the home and not being able to stay in the home. And I think in general, you know, when we talk about financial, especially the regulator's role, I think we often talk about risks changing and sort of in a way that's blind to the people that are experiencing it. And there's a huge risk in doing that by saying, if the hazard level is X, we just shouldn't lend there, or those types of rules that are very much ignorant of the context in which those rules are being enforced, and really risks kind of continuing this legacy of skewing the way that we invest to favor certain communities. So certainly in my work, I think, you know, one of the simple things is not just thinking about dollar values, but literally populations, right? Numbers of people who are exposed, where each person is counted equally towards the assessment of impacts of any type of policy or adaptation measure. And not to say that these total dollar figures don't matter, but that we know that focusing only on those can lead us to pathways that we don't actually really think are societally best overall.
Well, I think that is a perfect message to end on. So I think we should stop there. I don't know if anyone feels like we missed anything, but I feel like we covered an incredible amount of ground in this short time. So this was really fantastic. I want to thank the three of you for joining us today. You know, I hope we can reconvene in a few years and see what we missed, and see where things are on these super important topics as they evolve going forward.